In 2006, this guy, who's Al Gore, if you don't know who he was the Vice President of the United States under Bill Clinton. He's also been talking about climate change for a long time, much longer than even Hurricane Katrina. He's probably been talking about it since the 80s or 90s. But he was doing a series of lectures where he would go around and he would talk about climate change to people to try to get them to understand not only what was happening, but what was coming. And a group of people followed him around and they recorded him doing this, and they created a documentary based on a book that he did called An Inconvenient Truth. And it was an Oscar-winning documentary, and it was a time when people started to, again, recognize that something was going on, right? Something was a little different, and maybe it was something that we needed to pay attention to. Well, in the meantime, I'm driving to work in my SUV, because that's what you did, and I'm commuting and I'm emitting a lot of carbon and I'm not really thinking about it. But as I was driving to work one of these days and listening to the aftermath of Katrina and then thinking about this, I started to recognize that maybe something needed to change even within me. And maybe I needed to learn a little bit more about this thing called climate change. Like, what is this all about? Because I was one of those people that was like, oh, this is just it's a thing. It's a cycle that the Earth is going through. It's fine. Don't worry about it. These two events changed my mind about that. And they sent me on a different path. So I started looking around for opportunities to learn more about sustainability, this new phrase I was hearing about, and about climate change in general. And I ran into this guy. His name is Rob Fleming. And this is actually a magazine that's published in Philadelphia called Grid Magazine. This is issue number 2. It's up to 162 now. But Rob was on the cover, and he was talking about this new program that he was starting at what was then called Philadelphia University, and now is Jefferson. And it was the Sustainable Design Program. And I was like, okay, well, I'm a designer and I'm interested in this. Is this something that maybe I could do? So I looked into it and I was like, oh, but it's through the School of Architecture. I'm not an architect. I'm a graphic designer. I don't have a background in interior design. I'm not an engineer. So, what is this for me? And in all of the materials that I was looking at, Rob was kind of calling out to everybody. And so I had the opportunity to meet Rob and talk about the program and who he was looking for to join this program. It had just started. It was only about a year old when I was talking to him. And what he was looking for people like me. He was looking for people who were interested in bringing this idea of environmental consciousness and sustainability into different fields outside of architecture. Rob's an architect, and he has been for a very long time. But what he said to me that still sticks with me is that every job is a sustainability job. Because what you're doing is you're bringing in those thoughts into the work that you're doing as a designer, regardless of what you're doing, or into the work you're doing if you're an accountant, because you're maybe doing things a little differently, or if you're a purchaser and you're buying things for a company. If you think about it with a new lens of sustainability, he wanted to talk to you. So I was able to get into the program, and from 2008 to 2010, I did my master's program at Philly U. I was with a bunch of cool people, and a lot of them are still my friends to this day. Yes, there were architects, there were engineers, there were, interior designers, but there was also a national parks carpenter. And there was somebody that was doing work in the fashion industry. And there was somebody else that was, doing things in the nonprofit sector. So Rob was really trying to build a very inclusive program and bring in people from different places. So what I started to recognize is that this was giving me a little bit of peace of mind. And this is the peace part of this first act. Is that I was looking for peace of mind because I recognized that I needed to change, and I started to do things in my own life. I, gave up the SUV, parked the SUV in the driveway, and got a hybrid. And I started driving to work in a hybrid. I started changing the light bulbs in the house. I started doing all the low-hanging fruit things that people can do in their own lives. And I started to recognize that maybe in this very messy industry that I'm in the trade show world, I might be able to have some influence. The thing about trade shows is they usually only last a few days. And what you're doing is you're taking those structures that we build and you're putting them into cartons and containers and you're shipping them all over the country or all over the planet. You're putting down carpeting on the floor. The carpeting gets rolled up and thrown in a dumpster after the show's over. Brand new carpeting. Now that was definitely the case then when I was in the industry. I'm optimistic that it's less so now, but I still think that there is a lot of waste in that industry. So I was trying to, have peace of mind that at least I could do something and create, a different path. So I'm going to get into what I did for my thesis at the end of this, but I wanted to go to the love section next. So let's go there. So a lot of what I was doing in the trade show industry, the clients that we were working with, they were clients that came from all industries. So as you saw, that was General Dynamics, they're a defense contractor. They've been around a long time. They're actually a conglomeration of a bunch of different companies that came together, and our company was doing their trade show work. ExxonMobil was also a big client of our company because our company headquarters was in Chantilly, Virginia, which is just outside of DC. So you can imagine all the companies and industries that are in the DC area. So I started to have this moment of, well, maybe the things I'm doing helping these companies is a thing that maybe I could change. And I'd gotten this degree and I spent 8 years still working in my trade show industry, trying to affect change, but I didn't feel like I was able to do enough. Yes, my bosses were interested. Yes, they were supportive of what I was trying to bring into the company, but really they were not, ultimately the client was deciding, and especially then, a lot of the materials that you might use for sustainability, like better materials or, lower emissions and things like that, cost a lot more. So companies were always looking at the bottom line, and they were not looking really at the fact that they could, use a better carpet or something recycled. So as much as I was trying to make that change, it felt very slow. And to me, I always feel this sort of burn of urgency about this topic, where I always feel like, we need to keep going, we need to do more, we need to do more. And I think that's probably Rob's fault because that's what he tried to get all of us to believe and understand when we were taking his classes and in his program. So in 2018, my company that I'd worked for so long was sold to another company. It was a family-run business, and I was working directly for the nephew of the owner. He was my boss. We had a great rapport. The company got sold to a bigger fish, and that company was owned by basically venture capital. So they were somebody was backing them with money, and we were, they were coming in to change us and break us up a little bit. So I still was working with them, and they put me into a role that wasn't really exciting to me. They were making me do proposal work for clients. Their big clients were pharmaceutical companies. So I went from, oil and gas and into defense and now into pharmaceutical companies. And I decided that it wasn't for me anymore. So I started finally looking around to try to find a job. But with my sustainable design degree, but not being an architect or an interior designer, it was a little hard to sell that basically to companies where I'd go, well, I could make your designs look really cool or your presentations look good. But what I did find was that the nonprofit sector was waiting for me. So I wound up taking a job at a park, basically. More than a park, really. A place called Riverbend Environmental Education Center. And it's just outside of Philadelphia. It's a 30-acre nature preserve in the middle of what is a pretty affluent area outside of Philly. It's in Gladwin. But they were doing some really amazing stuff, and they were looking for somebody with a marketing background that could come in and help them with their communications. And I'm like, I could do that. I can help you with your website and do your emails and, help with events and do all the things with all the different things I had been doing and learning from the trade show industry. And so I took that job. And it felt really great on paper. And I loved my boss, the executive director who hired me. We really are still friends to this day. We really were on the same wavelength as far as what we wanted to do and how we wanted to grow the organization. And they did really cool things. They not only were a nature preserve where kids could come, and they have a summer camp, kids could come on field trips, they could learn about nature, they could be outside, but they also would go into areas where kids didn't have a lot of access to nature, where kids were, looking at concrete more than they were looking at green. And they were teaching them about nature and the environment in a way that was very approachable. So they were supplementing science in some of these school districts where they just didn't have this. There were statistically, sometimes kids that maybe saw science in their curriculum once a month. So my colleagues were able to go into these schools and they were able to teach them in a fun way about nature and connecting these kids to nature in a way that they couldn't in the past. So that little green thing on the end there, that's the mascot of Riverbend, and that's actually me in the mascot costume. Because what I learned about being in a nonprofit is, especially a small one, you have to wear many hats. You have to do a lot of things. We were 10 people. We would throw an event every fall for 800 people. It was a holiday festival around Halloween. We would throw a gala event. We would throw, all kinds of donor events. We were always working on the next thing. So you would successfully do a thing, and then you'd come back the next day, and you'd be like, okay, what's next? We're going to start. There's no breathing. There's no resting. There's no taking a minute. And the other thing about working in a nonprofit, you're chasing money a lot, right? Because you're reliant on donors and grants. And so there's always a development person that's working on trying to find that money. And as a marketing person, I was always part of supporting that, those communications. And I was also helping the education team, and I was also the photographer, and I was also the videographer. I was doing a lot, and I was learning a lot, and it was a great experience. But then something happened in 2020, COVID, right? So going into classrooms, that was no longer a thing. Bringing kids to us was no longer a thing. Even the events that we were doing, we couldn't do them, those fundraising events. We had to learn to adapt and become very flexible and get very creative about how we were going to move forward. The executive director that I worked for and that hired me, after COVID, she decided that after 15 years, she was ready to move on. So we hired a new executive director. And I get along with her too, but our philosophies about what environmental education is were a little different. Because to me, when you have environmental education in your name, it's not just for kids, it's for everybody. Because I went through this, whole program where I was told, every job is a sustainability job. Well, every point of contact with somebody is an opportunity to talk about environmental issues and to educate people. And because of COVID, we had to contract a little bit, so it was feeling like maybe that wasn't going to work in the same way that it used to. The programming changed a little bit. There was a lot of turnover. Well, in the meantime, I needed a creative outlet because, like everybody, I was at home. So I was hanging out at home with not a lot to do. So I decided to take a class in screen printing. That was through the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. But it was over Zoom. And I'm like, how's this going to work? Because Zoom and screen printing, I don't see how I'm going to be able to make this happen. But it actually worked great. I was able to learn a lot about the process of screen printing in a way that maybe I wouldn't have if I were doing it in person. Because if I were doing it in person, I would learn sort of the dark room technical side of screen printing that, I wouldn't have learned all these different methods of making stencils or monoprinting. We did a workshop here recently where we did a little bit of that, where we actually did monoprinting here, where we drew on the screen directly and we were able to make images and prints out of that. And I started to learn this appreciation for this medium that I had never touched before. It was really something new to me, but it became this sort of opportunity and vehicle for me to be able to express myself. So I was able to start making images that were my own voice. And I'd spent so many years working for other people, either in the corporate sector where I was working for clients that I didn't really agree with what they did, or when I was in the nonprofit sector where we were just churning and churning and churning and maybe not doing some of the things that I thought we could be doing. And so this was a chance for me to have a voice and have my own work and say what I wanted to say. And that felt very freeing to me. And it felt very exciting to me as a creative person. And it was the first time in 30 years that I was able to really do that. So I was able to do it at home, and then as soon as they opened the studio up, when we could safely go back after, we realized that wearing masks and getting vaccinations and things, there were different ways that you could safely approach these things. I went to the studio and I learned the other ways to do screen printing, and I kept going back. I kept taking the class over and over again. I probably took it 3 or 4 times, even though I didn't need to. It was just an opportunity for me to be in the studio space. And I recognized that was really something that was calling to me. So this part of my story is where I kind of found a love for and appreciation for environmental education and being in natural surroundings, like in this beautiful setting, being outside and not in my office until 8 o'clock every night, and also this love of screen printing. So that's the love part of my story. So the next part is the hope part, and this is what I call the hope symbol, and I'm going to get to that in just a second. So this is where I want to talk to you about my experiences at Jefferson and what I was doing there. So at Jefferson, Rob had been doing architecture for a very long time, and he was building this program. And one of the very first things he assigned us was this book called Ishmael. Has anybody ever read it? Know about it? So this is a book by Daniel Quinn, and it's basically a book that is a conversation, a telepathic conversation between a gorilla and a caretaker. And they're talking really deeply in a Socratic way. It's a very deep philosophical book about takers and leavers. And takers are what the gorilla thought, his name is Ishmael, thought were man, right? Because we take, we extract, we have, we feel that we are people that have the ability to change the world and have dominion and all the things. And the leavers are maybe the others that leave things the way they find them, or leave things better than they find them. And so the whole book was like this, and I'm like, what have I gotten into? What are we reading? I'm like, what is the point of this? But the point of it was to get us into a different mindset. This was going to be something different that we were going to be doing, and we were going to be working together to build the things that we were going to build as a group, and coming from all these different various walks of life. So that was pretty interesting to me. And so I want to talk a little bit about what I learned about sustainable design, which is the sort of topic of tonight. So does everybody know what this building is? Yeah, I see a lot of head nods, right? Good. This is Polywater, right? This is Frank Lloyd Wright. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is an amazing piece of architecture, and it's built on a waterfall, right? Do you think it's an example of sustainable design? You can raise your hand if you do. Anybody? No? Yes? Okay, one in the back. I would say it's an example of organic architecture. Organic architecture is what Frank Lloyd Wright's philosophy was about nature and architecture together. So he was suggesting that organic architecture means you look at the site where the thing is going to go, and then you design it in a way that it relates to the site. It feels like it belongs there, or it's already been there. But as a sustainable design, maybe it's not so much. Why? Well, because, first of all, Frank Lloyd Wright, the Kaufman, Edgar Kaufman, who came to Frank Lloyd Wright, who was a fan of Frank Lloyd Wright, just wanted a camp. This was like a vacation home for the Kaufmans. He wasn't looking for this, but he met with Wright, and he was like, sold, basically. Yeah, this is going to be terrific. And they met for about 9 months, and then the story goes that Kaufman was going to go see Wright in his office, and he called and he said, I'm on my way, I'll be there in about 2 hours. And apparently Wright had not even put a pen to paper yet. Now, people suggest that maybe, he's whipped this thing out in 2 hours. He didn't. He was thinking about it the whole time. It was in his mind. But he was the genius draftsman that was able to put this picture together that's absolutely, stunning renderings and a stunning building. But the thing about sustainable design that I learned when I was going to Jefferson was that sustainable design is so much more than just the picture and the building. It's so much more than just its connection to its natural surroundings. It's pulling everybody together. It's designing in community. It's designing in a way that all of the things you take into consideration, that you have a charrette process where you talk to all the stakeholders and you talk about what is this building going to do? How are we going to use it? How are we going to, live in this space? How are we going to use this space? What does the surroundings look like? How is the engineering and the systems and the R values and all the things? How are the materials? Those get talked about hopefully in the sustainable design process well in advance before the designs start going to the client. And then what happens is that process of coming together helps you make a building that is there for everybody, that answers all of the problems. This building, as soon as they poured the concrete, there were issues with it. It's not sustainable because they've had to go in and intervene in its construction multiple times because Wright had a vision and he didn't want to hear no. He built all the furniture that went inside, so the Kaufmans really didn't get to sort of pick their lounge chairs that they wanted to use. They got to live in Frank Lloyd Wright's vision. So this is a classic example of organic design. And what I learned was, it's not really sustainable design because it's not holistic. It's not a system that's coming together and working together. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting stuff. And the people that I was working with were doing really amazing things. And it came time for me to pick a thesis topic. And people were designing buildings. I had a friend who was worked for the government, so he was looking at carbon markets. I had another friend who started a nonprofit, literally, that still exists to this day as her thesis project. There were so many people doing really amazing things, and they're like, okay, what do you want to do? And I'm like, well, I don't know. What part can I play in this conversation? And they said, well, why don't you lean into your background, right? You know about branding and marketing and design, so why don't you do something that's related to that? And I was like, all right, I have an idea. This whole idea about climate change, it's not getting talked about enough, or there's a lot of confusing information. Maybe what I could do is develop a brand around sustainability. And they're like, okay. And they let me go off, and my thesis advisor was, we had many conversations on the phone about how we were going to pull this off. And I started doing my research, and I ran into this guy, and his name is Marty Neumeier, and he wrote a book. He's written several books, but this is called The Brand Gap. And the first thing I had to figure out was, what is branding, right? What does this really mean? And branding is not a logo. It's not a product. It's about a reaction. It's about an emotional gut reaction that you have when you associate with a brand. Think about if you watch a sports team at a game, all the people in the stands are wearing the colors of their team, most likely, or probably a majority of them. And you can sort of see the ones that are for the opposing team versus your team because they're in the different colors, but everybody's wearing branded apparel because they want to be a part of something. They want to feel like they are part of something, right? So that's what Marty was talking about. He was talking about the fact that your emotions are tied to brands. And that's why branding is successful. That's why some of us have iPhones and some of us have Androids, right? And the iPhone people are like, I'll never get an Android, and the Android people are the other way around, most likely. Not, I'm generalizing, but that's really what branding is. So I'm like, all right, I get that. What is sustainability? So I started looking at this concept of sustainability and where did this term even come from? And the term came from, it'd been around, but this idea of sustainability and sustainable development came from this thing called the Brundtland Commission, which is a UN commission studying sustainable development way back in the 80s. And they were talking about how we could design things in a way that were going to sustain us today, but also thinking about future generations. And that's what they were talking about. And the difference between sustainability and sustainable design, and the way I've come to think about it, is sustainable development is sort of the roadmap, and sustainability is the goal, is the end game, right? So that's what they were talking about, and they put this report out called Our Common Future. It's controversial a little bit because it didn't really take into consideration some of the poorer countries and how they were going to get to some of these goals, but at least it was a conversation that was starting. And it was taking, some of these things into play, like thinking about not just profitability or, financial stuff, but also thinking about, other things, taking other factors, planet and people, into effect. So you may have heard the 3 Ps of people, planet, and profit that kind of came from this report, right? So, okay, so I know what sustainability is, and I know what branding is, but I still wasn't quite putting those pieces together. And I'm like, I had to do a lot of case studies. I had to do some looking around, like who's done anything like this? And I found a lot of campaigns that were talking about sustainability. Like there's an organization that was popular at the time, they're still around, they were called 350.org. They were founded by a guy named Bill McKibben. And 350 is 350 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. That's what 350 means in that name. So 350.org was them saying, okay, because there was also a NASA climate scientist named James Hansen who went in front of Congress, and he said, okay, as long as we keep 350 or below parts per million in the atmosphere of carbon, we'll be okay. We're not going to see some of the really dramatic effects of climate. I hate to break it to you right now, but we're somewhere in the mid-400s, okay? But 350.org, what they were trying to do was develop these campaigns around the world and get people to bring awareness to this number so people might start thinking about what they could do to reduce their carbon output. By the way, carbon footprint is a thing that Shell Oil came up with to provide accountability for carbon emissions to all of us versus to them. So just that's a sidebar fact, but 350.org was still, they were talking more about like globally, what could we do? Industrially, through our economics, what are the things we could do? But it kind of got conflated a little bit into what do we all do if we change our light bulbs and if we drive different cars or take the bus or whatever, is that going to make a difference? So that was one of the things that I looked at. Another story that I found that was an aha moment for me in this process was this one. This is the peace symbol. Did everybody recognize this? They've seen it, you've seen it probably a million times in your life, right? It's this ubiquitous, universal symbol for peace. Well, like a lot of things, there's a designer behind these things. And maybe you don't know his name, but tonight you will. So if you ever go for bar trivia and they're talking about the peace symbol, you're going to win because you're going to have some answers. So the symbol, so this guy, his name is Gerald Holtham, and he was a designer in the UK in the late 1950s. Now, if you think about the 50s, what that time was, it was the post-war era, and it was the beginning of what they call the atomic age, right? So World War II had ended. The UK especially, and in Europe in general, went through a lot of devastation from the war. But the war really kind of ended, especially in the Pacific, because the United States had the nuclear bombs, and they dropped them on the Japanese cities of, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So everybody decided, especially Eisenhower gave a speech, and he said, well, if we have atoms for peace, meaning if we all have the bomb, then we won't use it, because we're all going to go, no, we can't use this, it would be just too devastating to use it. So there were these campaigns to try to, promote the atomic benefits of, nuclear power and nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. But the people in the UK were like, no way, we don't want this. The United States had a base over there, and they were starting to help the UK build nuclear weapons at a place called Aldermaston. So a group of people got together in the late 50s, and they said, no way, we do not want this, so we're going to have a march. We're going to march to Aldermaston from London, which I think is somewhere around 60 miles. So we're going to, take a weekend and do this. And we want people to see us and to understand what we're talking about. So they came to Gerald, and Gerald said, I have this idea for, something that's going to show up on the new media of the day, because the new media in the late 50s was TV, and it was black and white TV. And there was a lot of newspapers that were using black and white photography. So he knew that contrasting images, like these black and white peace symbols that you see in this photo, were going to catch people's attention and be something different. And he had this, feeling of despair because he was worried about war. So he referenced Goya's painting, which you see here, and the figure in white with his arms upstretched. But then he started thinking about, well, how can I put this into a symbol? And he started looking at flag semaphore. And flag semaphore is where you take flags and you spell out letters. And if you're into sailing or you need to communicate at a distance, this was a way you could do it. So he took the letters of flag semaphore, the N, which is the chevron shape, and the D, which is the up and down one, and he combined those together. So N and D stands for nuclear disarmament. So this is just a symbol that says nuclear disarmament. That's what the peace symbol actually is when you pull it apart. The Coalition for Nuclear Disarmament, they used this successfully in their marches, and people saw this, and they decided they didn't want to do any copywriting of this, so they decided to just let it be out in the world. And all these different, it was the 60s now, all these different movements started to see the symbol, and they said, hey, we want to use that. That's really great. And they're talking about war versus peace. We want peace. The civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam movements, the women's rights movements all started picking up on this symbol. And the symbol now has become this ubiquitous thing that we all just say is the peace symbol. But it started somewhere. And I was like, all right, as a designer, this is the coolest story I've heard in a long time. Because here's a guy who just was trying to do this thing for this march, and it's evolved, it's grown way more than he ever expected that it would. So I was like, well, okay. So we're doing all of these things. We're learning about sustainability at Jefferson with all my friends. Everybody's doing all this amazing, great work. Why are we doing this? This is hard work. I mean, I was going to, classes at night. I was still working full time, trying to have a life in between for 2 years, doing a lot of school. My friends were all doing basically the same thing. And I'm like, what is it that's motivating us? And I started to really think about it. And I was like, you know what? I think it's hope. I think hope is what is pushing us. Rather than despairing and doing nothing, hope as an emotion is actually a motivator. And it's not hope when I mean, when I say hope as in, I wish this is going to change and I'm not going to do anything about it. It's hope as in, I'm hoping for a better outcome. So I'm going to put the work in to make that better outcome happen. And there's a lot that's written. I have a lot of books on hope, right? So Rebecca Solnit's somebody that's very famously talked about hope. Jane Goodall talks about hope. Hope actually fires in your brain a little differently in your frontal cortex, or it actually gives you a little bit of a boost, right? When you're feeling hopeful about something, it actually gives you some encouragement to move forward. So ultimately, what I wound up creating was this. So this is what I call the hope symbol. And I was in a hotel room on a business trip, and I was in my sketchbook, and I sketched this out. And I'm going to grab some water, sorry. So I sketched this out, and I started doing a little development, and I was working with a design firm, and they were helping me out with this. And I had it straight up and down, and they said, you know what? The Earth is on a 22.5 degree axis. Why don't you tilt the symbol and put that into the symbol? And I said, that's a great idea. So that's why it's on an angle like that, which confuses people because everybody's like, which way does it go? But that's the reason it is that way, because it's referencing the Earth. So there I was. I, developed this symbol, and I'm like, all right, is there such a thing as a hope symbol? Like, I better do some research on that. So I started looking around. Nope. Hopesymbol.com was out there in the world. And at that time, I'm like, if there's nobody parked on this hopesymbol.com, then there's no hope symbol. So I'm buying it. So I bought all the URLs, even before I had graduated. I'm like, I'm gonna sit on these because I'm gonna call this thing the hope symbol, and I'm gonna have a website. And I don't know what the website's gonna say yet, but I wanna make sure that I grab this. And it kind of gave me this, like, pointing me in the right direction, like, okay, this is okay, right? And there's some other symbols that do mean hope. There's an anchor that's used in, sort of older stuff, but it's not really something that everybody is affiliating with hope. And what I was trying to do was develop something that could sit next to the peace symbol. Because I was like, well, the peace symbol carried us in through the 20th century, right? That was the latter half of the 20th century after World War II. We need something else to sit next to it. And then I thought, well, and there's maybe needs to be a friend in the middle, which is love. So the three symbols that you've seen throughout the presentation are my interpretation of the peace symbol, a symbol for love, and a symbol for hope. Because those are the things that I think, personally, we really need in the world, right? And there's things worth working toward. So, okay, so 2010, I graduate. I got an A on my project and my thesis, yay. And then I was like, okay, now what? I'm still working in this industry that's kind of not doing great stuff. I'm, still 8 years away from going into the nonprofit stuff. It kind of just sat there for a long time. I kept the domain up, I had a website on it, but I wasn't really sure what to do with it. I tried a lot of stops and starts. I was like, okay, should it be a rating system for things? Like you get 4 hope symbols if you're, doing a sustainable thing. Nah, that didn't feel right. Should it be an app that counts your carbon footprint? Oh, wait, carbon footprint, that's something that we need to pay attention to, but it's not really something that we can, is going to change everything. So that didn't feel right. So going back to my story about COVID and learning how to screen print, in 2023, after working at the nonprofit for 5 years, I was like, you know what? I'm ready to go be an artist full-time. So I decided to leave the nonprofit and decided to take my screen printing practice that I had fallen in love with and turn it into my next act in my life. And that's what's brought me here tonight. So this is me in the studio, and this is my bio up there on the wall. And I call my art practice the Hope Symbol Project because it's always been a project to me from the beginning. And it's not finished, and it won't be finished. and probably in my lifetime. But I want to be here communicating. I'm grateful to be here with you tonight, and it's this art practice that brought me here. This gallery that we're sitting in has my work in it, and this is giving me the opportunity to have a role where I can come out and talk about these things to everybody and talk to you, and we can have a dialogue about things, and maybe you can see that my nonlinear meandering path actually brought me right here. And it's a role that I feel that I need to play. It's a calling almost that I feel that I have. And I don't know where it's going to take me. The last few years have been a trip. Everything's a little bit different. I don't have a 9-to-5 job anymore. I make my schedule, and I do as much art making as I can. And the art is my expression of asking these questions. And one of the questions that I like to ask is, what's your role? When you're looking at my art, what do you see? What is the role that you're trying to have in this world? And so that's really why I'm here. And as you are all, most of you are starting off on your careers, I just want to leave you with that question. What's your role going to be? What way can you, like the wall over there says, what is your legacy going to be? Now, those are big questions, and nobody's expecting you to have those answers right now. But as you're going through your careers and you're making decisions, you really should listen to your instincts and your heart, because a lot of the times when I made changes or I went in a different direction, it's because I felt something inside that was telling me that this was the right move, and I was listening to those instincts. And all the while, I wanted to have creativity and positivity be part of that. And I don't know where this is going, but I know that right now it's, the place where I am, and I want to keep making this work. And what you're seeing also is other people that are expressing themselves in this gallery. I'm also part of a group called the American Color Print Society. And what you're seeing is people using art to express themselves creatively, to get out the things that are in their minds or in their hearts that they otherwise can't articulate. So I also encourage you to keep that in your work and in what you do, some form of positive creativity, even if it's just a thing you do on the side just for fun, even if it's just, scribbling in a sketchbook or taking a workshop somewhere. Please keep that as part of your practice, because it's going to make you a well-rounded designer. It's going to make you a well-rounded architect or a well-rounded human being. And we need, especially now, this creativity to be part of our world that we're living in. So thank you all very much.